Hey heroes, happy holidays, happy new year, and welcome to another uncanny episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This week we are looking at a selection of early stories from the comic magazine Strange Tales. But first, let me just say that this channel is supported in part by fans via Patreon. For only $1 a month, you'll be able to vote in monthly polls that help decide on topics that get covered on the channel, and I genuinely appreciate everybody who signs up. As the name implies, the book we're looking at today was originally a horror anthology series which featured strange stories and terrifying tales from before the Marvel Age of Heroes. This was during what is referred to as the Atlas era, as Marvel was known as Atlas Comics at the time. During the Age of Monsters, the book shifted from overt horror into a more science fiction focus. It introduced a number of giant beasts which would subsequently return in the Marvel Universe proper, perhaps most notable of which being the alien dragon Fin Fang Foom. Finally, when the Marvel Age got into full swing and superheroes became the norm, Strange Tales shifted again to reflect that. Starting with number 101, half of each issue was dedicated to the Human Torch, the youngest member of the Fantastic Four. Fittingly enough, 10 issues later, this series also introduced Marvel's master of the mystic arts, Doctor Strange. For a while, each installment featured a Human Torch story and a Doctor Strange story. From issue 123, the Torch's features co-starred his fantastic teammate, The Thing, but these were dropped when the book instead introduced Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. While the character of Nick Fury had previously appeared as Sergeant Fury in his own book, which depicted him and his Howling Commandos battling Nazis during World War II, the feature in Strange Tales took place in the then modern day and was more of a spy thriller. And so it was also Strange Tales that established Marvel Universe mainstays S.H.I.E.L.D. and Hydra. Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos continued to be published at the same time, so readers were able to enjoy new stories of Nick Fury from two different time periods and genres. For the remainder of the book's original run as Strange Tales, which ended with number 168, each issue featured a chapter of Doctor Strange and one featuring Nick Fury. In its final 2 years, these would alternate who was featured on the cover, with Fury one month and Strange the next. Then in 1968, each character was given their own book. While Fury's story continued in Nick Fury Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. number 1, Strange Tales changed its title and became Doctor Strange with number 169. That series continued until number 183, and several years later the title Strange Tales returned. However, it didn't continue the Doctor Strange numbering and instead picked up where it left off with Strange Tales number 169, which introduced another mystical character, Brother Voodoo. The series then reprinted stories from older magazines and presented new tales of the mythical Golem, an animated statue from Jewish folklore who'd previously appeared in the pages of The Incredible Hulk. Subsequent issues starred the cosmic hero Adam Warlock and featured the first appearances of Gamora and the Magus. While Warlock's story continued in his own series, Doctor Strange returned to Strange Tales, albeit in the form of reprinted older stories, while new adventures were being presented in his own book, which had since restarted with a new number 1. And so the original Strange Tales numbering ended for a second time with issue 188 in 1976. Of course, the title would make sporadic returns over the years, albeit with new numberings. After Doctor Strange's second solo series ended, he was featured in the second volume of Strange Tales, which ran for 19 issues in the late 80s. This time he shared the book with Cloak and Dagger, the vigilante duo introduced in Spider-Man titles. Since then, any further uses of the name were short-lived, with a 1994 one-shot paying homage to the book's 1960s features, and several subsequent miniseries and Infinity Comics delivering their own Strange Tales. The original Strange Tales numbering isn't gone for good, however. At one point, books that had been rebooted several times went back to their original numbering, adding the issues of subsequent volumes to come up with a legacy number. However, in the case of Doctor Strange, because his original solo series began with number 169, his legacy numbering includes the original 168 issues of Strange Tales. While these legacy numbers are not currently used as the primary number for a single issue, they are typically denoted on the covers next to the letters LGY. But now let us jump back to the start of that legacy and look at a selection of Strange Tales from the book's first year of publication. Although let me also say that videos like this do tend to get fewer views than ones focusing on specific characters, so if you do like this kind of thing and want to see more, be sure to let me know by leaving a like and a comment. Our first story this week comes from Strange Tales number 2 and is called The Pin. This tale begins on a rainy day when a man named Walter Ambrose found a lone infant lying in a basket on his doorstep. The child was carrying a small pin which Walter was pricked with after bringing the boy inside. Unable to find the baby's parents, Walter decided to look after the child himself and named him Buster. Raising Buster seemed to have a positive effect on the man, who began to look and feel more youthful. At the same time, Buster was growing up abnormally fast and displayed intelligence beyond his apparent age. This continued to accelerate, and Walter expected the child to start school by joining the 2nd grade. However, by the time he'd arrived at the building to enroll him, Buster was old and advanced enough for the 6th or 7th grade. Meanwhile, Walter continued to grow younger, and soon people at his work were mistaking him for a boy. Soon Buster aged into a teenager while Walter's body was reduced to that of a child. While his adult consciousness still existed in his mind, it seemed as though he couldn't help but behave in a way befitting his apparent age, essentially leaving him a prisoner in his own body while Buster was the one looking after him. Then, when Walter was reduced to the form of a baby, Buster finally revealed the truth. You see, he was actually a 55-year-old scientist named Professor Lungham, who had inadvertently de-aged himself too far in his experiments with human rejuvenation. However, he had prepared a special device that would allow him to drain the years from someone else and return him to adulthood, provided they shared the same blood type. Lungham left Walter on another doorstep with the device, the same pin he carried as a baby. Sure enough, another man opened the door and found the baby Walter, who could only pray that their blood would be compatible, lest he remain trapped as an infant. Next up, from issue number 3, is a story simply called The Shadow. This tale stars a man named Dick Coyne, whose relationship with a woman named Iris earned him the ire of George Dykes. This enmity came to a head when George struck his rival in a jealous rage, knocking Dick onto the sidewalk. Dick stood up again, but was determined not to let George's brutish threats ruin his relationship with Iris. But the following evening, when he went to meet Iris for their next date, there was no answer at her home. He suspected that George had done something to sabotage him, but then Dick Coyne noticed something truly peculiar. Somehow his shadow began to move unnaturally away from him, disconnecting from his feet in an impossible manner. He assumed it had to be some strange trick of the light that he didn't understand and followed after it, but soon his shadow ran away completely. He tried to put the queer occurrence behind him and attempted again to contact Iris, but she hung up without acknowledging him when he called. He grew more frustrated and confused when he walked out onto the street and saw that everyone and everything was casting a shadow except for him. He wandered and searched until he finally caught sight of it again and tried to catch it. Dick gave chase as the shadow ran, leading him to a cemetery where a funeral was being held. He saw Iris there, but she failed to acknowledge his presence, and soon Dick Coyne realized why. The funeral they were attending was his own, for it seems that Dick never did get up again after being struck by George. At the very least, George had been tried and convicted quickly and was sentenced to death for breaking Dick's neck. With nothing left to do, Dick crawled into his own grave while his murderer was put to rest not far away. Our next strange tale from that same issue is called The Man Who Never Was. Let's begin this story with a reporter named Jerry Bramley, who decided to visit his old college friend Paul Kendrick. Paul, it seems, had been investigating the personification of death, but was concerned that the lack of information on the subject meant that something had happened to others who did the same. Jerry was dubious, but could see that Paul was distressed and offered to call him the next morning so they could go to lunch together and discuss the matter further. But sometime after midnight, Jerry was awakened as Paul called him, declaring that death had come for him. The phone soon disconnected, and when Jerry attempted to call back, the number no longer worked. He decided to rush back to Paul's home, but found a vacant lot where the house should have been. He asked a nearby police officer, who claimed that the address had been an empty lot for as long as he could remember. He then reached out to Paul's friends and family, but it seemed as though none of them had ever even heard of Paul Kendrick. Finally, he contacted the one man he thought could help, their mutual friend, Roger Hunt. The two went to get a drink at a cafe where both of them were well known, and Jerry broke the news that Paul had disappeared. But despite the fact that they were apparently inseparable during their college years, Roger also had no memory of him. Jerry showed him a picture that originally depicted all three of them, but Paul had even disappeared from that. Roger naturally had a hard time believing this, but agreed to listen to Jerry's story from the beginning. And so Jerry told him everything he knew, including Paul's fears that death would come to erase him for investigating its true nature. Roger came to the conclusion that it was more likely for Jerry to have hallucinated Paul than for everyone else to have forgotten him, and wanted to get his friend professional help. But first, Jerry needed to call his editor as he hadn't checked in at the office all day and stepped away to do so. Roger waited for his friend to return, but began to grow concerned, particularly after the cafe employees insisted that he had come in alone. This was exacerbated when they also claimed that they didn't know anyone named Jerry. Roger then went to grab the photo of himself and Jerry, only to find that he was now the only one in the picture. Realizing now that he knew too much as well, Roger rushed out into the street in a panic, but it was too late. The last thing Roger Hunt ever felt was the specter of death closing around him. The next morning, the photograph he dropped was picked up by a group of young boys who thought it strange to find an oddly framed picture of a tree with nobody in it. The next strange tale from issue number 4 is Dial City Morgue. This story begins with our protagonist, Ted, just after installing a new phone in his apartment. He was about to call his girlfriend, Ellie Bennett, but upon noticing the time, remembered that he needed to contact a colleague, Jeff Norris. However, upon dialing the number, a deep voice on the other end spoke in a dismal tone, simply saying, "City Morgue?" Jeff apologized, assuming he'd dialed the wrong number, but upon carefully trying again, was met with the same result. Shortly after that, he called Ellie instead and fortunately got through, explaining that he would be slightly late to their date as he needed to meet Jeff in person first. Ted attempted to catch Jeff in front of his apartment, but was shocked to see his colleague fatally struck by a passing car. He told Ellie everything that happened later that night, and she assured him that it must have been a horrible coincidence. However, Ted was convinced that there was more at play and elected to investigate further the next day. Using the serial number, he learned that the phone had been used by the city morgue throughout the previous year. Using a contact at the morgue, he also procured a list of all the deaths that had been reported during that time period. And soon he realized that one of them was listed for June 10th at 8:15 p.m., the same time and date that he tried to call Jeff. He deduced that if he called someone at the same time as a listed death, that person would perish as well, and for a while he was careful not to use this power. But then he started to have money trouble when his latest business venture began to go poorly. He started to fear that he'd never be able to afford a proper wedding for himself and Ellie, and she suggested that he get to be more friendly with his wealthy aunt, Jane. However, Ted had a more sinister idea, and, consulting the list of deaths, called Jane at a time that would ensure hers. Sure enough, only 15 minutes later, he received a call revealing that Jane had fallen down the stairs and died. Not long after that, Ted received a sizable inheritance from his aunt's estate, putting him and Ellie on Easy Street. Having no need or desire to kill anyone else, he then only used the list of deaths to avoid any unnecessary incidents. But then one day, while trying to contact Ellie, he heard that same familiar, dreary voice say, "City Morgue." He quickly realized that the clock he'd checked was slow, and had inadvertently called his beloved at a time of death. He rushed off to find her, meeting her at a carnival just as a thunderstorm was brewing in the skies above. She was about to get on a merry-go-round again to retrieve her gloves, but Ted stopped her. He went to get the gloves himself, but as he did, a bolt of lightning struck the ride. The carousel shattered and shards of twisted metal flew towards Ted. While Ellie survived, the doctor on the scene declared that Ted had mere moments to live, and so they'd better call the city morgue. Our penultimate tale for this video is called The Room Without a Door, and was later reprinted in Chamber of Chills number 16. This story features a man named Henry who sought to use black magic to unlock the secrets of time travel. His colleagues, Wilkins and Matterly, tried to dissuade him from this path, insisting that science was the true way to progress. Interestingly, their argument was not that the supernatural didn't exist, but rather that such forces could not be safely controlled. However, Henry was convinced that he could harness the power of black magic and tried for months without success. Then one day, he learned of a woman named Albitra Nurse, who was related to a notorious witch that was supposedly executed in 1692. Albitra lived in a broken-down old house that was previously abandoned and refused to speak to anyone. But Henry was determined and knocked on the door until she was forced to answer. The woman who came to the door was very much a stereotypical old witch and told Henry to go away before slamming the door in his face once again. However, the determined man continued to skulk around the house and peered through the cracks in the window shade. Inside, he witnessed Albitra summon forth her deceased relative, Roxana Nurse, pulling her forward in time and saving her from the fires of the Salem witch trials. Henry also overheard them claiming that Roxana was safe as long as their secret remained hidden in the room without a door. He began plotting a way to get into the property and find that room, and then Henry made a discovery. The house in question didn't actually belong to Albitra, but to the municipal government, who'd simply allowed her to squat there after being unable to sell the property for years. And so Henry was more than happy to purchase the estate for himself and subsequently force the old witch out, despite the fact that she was a descendant of the original owner. He quickly got to work ripping the house apart in search of the room without a door. Eventually, he'd found it, a relatively small box with pictures of a room on the outside, but no visible opening. and so he did the only logical thing and broke it open with a hammer. There appeared to be nothing inside, but a moment later Henry heard the screams of 1,000 voices and felt himself being pulled backwards through time. You see, while Roxana Nurse had been saved from a fiery fate, it seems that by opening the room without a door, Henry had taken her place. Our final strange tale for this week's episode comes from issue number 7 and is called My Brother Talks to Bats. This tale begins in the Hungarian village of Sverna, where the Chismadia family lived. Vid Chismadia always suspected there was something different about his brother George, as their parents, Eva and Janos, always kept him locked up. However, George had a habit of escaping, and one night Vid decided to follow him. He tracked him to an old castle that allegedly belonged to the vampire lord Dracula before his most recent defeat. There, Vid saw his brother talking to the bats and wondering what he really was. It seems that sometimes George felt like an inhuman beast who could feed on human blood given the chance. He ran off into the night, and Vid, unable to follow his brother further, decided to return home before his parents learned that he'd snuck out as well. He knew that George would return before the morning, as he always did, but was concerned as his father had told him that their entire family would be in danger if the town found out about George. Sure enough, George Chismadia did later return with no memory of what he had done while wandering the forest. Soon after, he and his father heard on the radio news of yet another vampire attack near their town of Sverna. George came to the horrible conclusion that he was the vampire, but his parents insisted it wasn't true and forced him into the basement. They chained him to the wall so that he would never be able to escape and reveal his secret to the town. After all, the rest of the vampires in Sverna would surely execute the Chismadias if they found out that a respectable undead family were harboring a half-human like George. Now, you may wonder if these older tales can really be considered canon in the Marvel Universe proper. And so let me point out that in the 2011 Marvel Vampires Handbook, George and his family are indeed listed in the appendix, meaning that this story did in fact happen, and that George may very well still be locked away in the family's basement. But that is all I've got for you this week, so thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks here. And you can vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel. But that's all I've got for you guys for now, and so until next year, true believers, Excelsior!